How much money do you have in your pocket right now? Well, 21. Could something that small make an impact on something as big as your retirement? Well, you start with that money towards your retirement and let it grow over time for 20, 30 years. That retirement challenge might not seem so big after all.
Artists put their work on display before an eager international market, while limits to expression remain. Those are some of the stories we're covering on tonight's PBS News.
The mayor of Charleston, South Carolina, called it pure, concentrated evil. The city and state reeled today from a bloody assault, a white shooter gunning down black victims at a place of worship. The suspect was captured in a neighboring state, but the motive remained a mystery. The manhunt ended late this morning when a tip led police to the alleged gunman's car, nearly 250 miles away from the shooting scene. Confirmation came from the police chief in Charleston.
We've arrested Dylan Roth, R-O-O-F, from Lexington, South Carolina. Approximately 30 minutes ago, he was arrested in Shelby, North Carolina, during a traffic stop.
Still images from surveillance video show the 21-year-old Roth outside the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church last night. Police said he was inside for an hour before opening fire in a prayer meeting. 9 people died, including the pastor Clemente Pinckney, a Democratic state senator who recently helped pass legislation requiring police to wear body cameras. At the White House, President Obama, who knew Pinckney, voiced both sympathy and frustration, with Vice President Biden at his side.
Now is the time for mourning and for healing. But let's be clear. At some point, we as a country will have to reckon with the fact that this type of mass violence does not happen in other advanced countries. It doesn't happen in other places with this kind of frequency. And it is in our power to do something about it.
Members of Congress held a prayer vigil for the shooting victims, as did state lawmakers in Columbia, South Carolina, where Clemente Pinckney's desk was draped in black. In 2012, the preacher and lawmaker reflected on his political role on the PBS series Many Rivers to Cross with Henry Louis Gates Jr.
We need to be a part if we want to stay in our own life, if we want to be independent, if we want to influence what's happening around us, or the reverse is to let everybody else control and influence. And then we just sort of take whatever comes. That's what slaves did.
Pinckney's Emmanuel AME Church dates back to slave times, 1816, and is one of the oldest black churches in the South. But it was unclear today what turned it into a target. A Facebook picture showed the suspect, Roth, wearing a jacket with flag patches from apartheid-era South Africa and Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. And U.S. Attorney General Loretta Lynch said the Justice Department has formally launched a hate crime investigation. Back in Charleston, emotional Governor Nikki Haley spoke for many, struggling to make sense of it all.
The heart and soul of South Carolina was broken. And so we have some grieving too. And we've got some pain we have to go through. Parents are having to explain to their kids how they can go to church and feel safe. And that's not something we ever thought we'd deal with.
All of this came just 2 months after Walter Scott, an unarmed black man, was shot and killed by a white police officer in neighboring North Charleston. We'll come back to the Charleston attack and hate crimes in general after the news summary.
In the day's other developments, President Obama's trade agenda got a reprieve after Democrats in the U.S. House of Representatives blocked it last week. Today, Republicans pushed through fast-track negotiating authority, clearing the way for an Asian free trade deal. The bill now goes to the Senate. Still to come, votes on helping workers who lose their jobs to overseas competition.
Wall Street rallied today on hopes that the Federal Reserve may wait just a while longer before raising interest rates. The Dow Jones Industrial Average gained 180 points to close at 18,115. The Nasdaq rose 68 points, and the S&P 500 added 20.
Leaders of the Eurozone countries have called an emergency summit for Monday on their deadlock with Greece. Finance ministers met in Luxembourg today as Greece faced a looming deadline to make a huge loan repayment or default. The Eurogroup chair warned of too little progress.
As of today, it is still possible to find an agreement and extends the current program before the end of the month. The ball is clearly in the Greek court to seize that last opportunity.
Meanwhile, Greek Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras traveled to St. Petersburg, Russia, to meet with President Vladimir Putin. There is widespread speculation that Tsipras is now seeking rescue loans from the Kremlin.
Number of refugees fleeing war and persecution worldwide has reached an all-time high. The UN Refugee Agency reported today that nearly 60 million people were displaced from their homes last year. The largest single group, 11.6 million, came from Syria.
In Hong Kong, the governing council balked today, giving China's central government veto power over candidates for chief executive of the city. It was a victory for activists who staged long-running protests last year. Today, pro-Beijing lawmakers walked out before the vote, leaving opponents of the election plan in control. Officials in Beijing criticized the outcome.
And back in this country, gender equality is coming to the $10 bill. The U.S. Treasury Secretary announced today the redesigned version will feature a yet-to-be-named woman. It will be unveiled in 2020, marking 100 years since women gained the right to vote.
Still to come on the NewsHour, the South Carolina church shooting, suspect in custody as a city reels in the wake of shocking violence. The Pope wades in controversial territory in a call to halt climate change, reshuffling big-name anchors in TV news. Two major First Amendment decisions come down at the Supreme Court. Workers fighting to earn the overtime pay they put in, and a new market for Cuban artists.
We now return to the struggle for understanding in Charleston, as the city mourns 9 people killed in a historic black church last night. For more on today's developments, we turn to South Carolina Representative Jim Clyburn, whose district includes parts of Charleston, and Heidi Byron, who directs the Southern Poverty Law Center's Intelligence Project in Montgomery, Alabama. Thank you for joining us. Congressman Clyburn, how is Charleston coping with this?
Well, Charleston is coping very well. I think that the law enforcement people here of the suspect in this case is serving this overall process very well. But the fact still remains, people are wanting some answers to the question of why. Why did this happen? Was he acting alone? How did this church, the most historic African-American church in Charleston, South Carolina, for that matter, in the entire South, why did he pick this church? Is he a part of something else beyond him? I think when we get the answers to these questions, this community will know better how to respond.
You yourself, I believe, are a member of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, Congressman, and you knew Reverend Pinckney. How would you describe the personal scope of this loss?
Well, I think that the church service that we had at noon today, was probably, I think Bishop Bryant said it well. It was probably the most diverse group. He said that he's seen in a long, long time. I was a part of all these events right here in Charleston during the 1969 hospital strike. Back during the 70s and even the 60s, when we were involved in rights activities. But never have I seen a sanctuary in any church as representative of the entire community that I see today. And so I think this community is galvanizing, it is coalescing, it is coming together in a way that I think will serve great purposes going forward.
Heidi Byrick, we heard both the Justice Department and the Mayor of Charleston today describe this as a hate crime. We could use a few definitions here. What makes it that? What make it that?
Well, there are two pieces of evidence related to the shooter that probably make this a hate crime. One, the comments that have been attributed to him about how, you people are taking over our country, you're raping our women. Those are racist statements which would indicate motive. The other thing that we found throughout the day today is this person has been put on Facebook pages and other places with pictures wearing racist patches, glorifying, for example, the apartheid government in Rhodesia. He also had a license plate that said Confederate States of America. The fact that he had these insignia, the fact that he said these things indicates that his motives might be racial.
Ms. Byrick, are houses of worship typical targets for these kinds of crimes? We can think all the way back to Birmingham at the 16th Street Baptist Church. We can think about the church burnings in the South. And I wonder if there's a theme or if there's a through line in all of these.
We have seen for decades that houses of worship, particularly historically black churches, have been targeted by white supremacists for violence. This has been happening for quite a long time. The Law Center, in fact, sued a Klan group in the 90s for attacking a black church also in South Carolina. And I think the fact that this church was so significant historically may have actually made it more of an object for violence, unfortunately.
We are shocked when we hear things like this. The assumption, Heidi Byrick, is that this no longer happens. Is that, or at least doesn't happen in a regular way? Are we mistaken in that?
That would be a mistaken belief. The fact of the matter is that lone wolf terrorist attacks by people who have white supremacist or extreme anti-government beliefs have actually happened about every 5 weeks for the last 5 years. They haven't all actually taken place, but there have been attempts. This kind of violence is really out of control, this kind of domestic terrorism. And if we just think for a little bit, you'll remember the shooting at the Sikh temple by a skinhead in 2012, the shooting a year ago by a white supremacist at a Jewish community facility in Kansas. These kinds of things are happening with regularity.
So Congressman Clyburn, what should we as a people, or maybe even government or not government, do about these things? What happens next?
Well, let me say this about the lone wolf kind of thing. This young man may have been acting alone, but what were his motivations? Who or what led to him developing these kinds of feelings? He's got these distinct tattoos. He's posting things on Facebook. He's got this Confederate States of America insignia on the front of his automobile. These are not lone wolf activities. These are organized activities emanating from somewhere. Now, just because he acted alone in this doesn't mean that he's not getting his motivation from some other kind of organized effort taking place. And that's why I think we need to get to the bottom of this. Now, it's one thing to wake up and pick up a book or look on the TV and want to go out and emulate something. But it's something else, again, to develop a whole philosophy, a whole theory, a whole approach to life by tuning in to these coordinated efforts being put forth out here by hate groups all over the country. So just because you're acting alone does not mean that you are not motivated by something broader and higher than you are.
Well, we will watch this unfold. Representative Jim Clyburn, the Poverty Law Center. Thank you both very much.
Pope Francis made an unprecedented global call to action to tackle climate change today. He issued the first encyclical dedicated solely to the environment, calling it one of the principal challenges facing humanity in our day. It was a kickoff of an effort to spread the message to the faithful and others in months to come. Pope Francis issued a nearly 200-page document casting climate change as a moral issue, not simply a political or economic debate.
Christianity.
Lead climate researchers joined in the formal release at the Vatican.
I think the encyclical, by listening to the science and to reflecting to the science, is bringing together two big messages. One message comes from reasoning, from ingenuity, from technological progress. The other comes from faith, moral, ethical values, Christianity. But they combine into one message.
That message to the world's 1.2 billion Roman Catholics is global warming is mostly man-made. It comes heavily from burning fossil fuel, and it disproportionately harms the poor. In the encyclical, the pontiff warns the pace of consumption, waste, and environmental change has so stretched the planet's capacity that our contemporary lifestyle, unsustainable as it is, can only precipitate catastrophes. Rich countries must act immediately, Francis says, to cut consumption of fossil fuels and help poor nations create sustainable development. But Cardinal Peter Turkson, who helped pen the first draft, acknowledged today it's a tough sell.
There are discussions on environmental issues where it is not easy to achieve a consensus. The Church does not claim to settle scientific questions to replace politics. But quoting Pope Francis, I encourage an honest and open debate so that particular interests or ideologies do not jeopardize the common good.
To promote that debate, Catholics around the world were able to view the announcement via live stream from the Vatican. But the papal document also drew criticism. Republican presidential candidate Jeb Bush, who's Catholic, said yesterday in Iowa, I go to church to have my faith nourished, to have my faith challenged. I don't go to Mass for economic policy or for things in politics. And the Senate's leading climate change skeptic, Republican James Inhofe of Oklahoma, dismissed what he called the Pope's philosophy on global warming. Even so, supporters are hoping the encyclical will push the United Nations Climate Summit to reach agreement later this year. President Obama said he admired the Pope's decision to issue today's historic call with his, quote, full moral authority. But in the U.S. Senate, Republicans voted against funding several administration initiatives on curbing climate change and clean water rules. This morning, I spoke with the Archbishop of Washington, Cardinal Donald Wuerl, about the Pope's encyclical. We met at the National Press Club. Your Eminence, Cardinal Donald Wuerl, thank you for speaking with us.
Judy, it's a pleasure to be here.
Why did Pope Francis want to devote an entire encyclical to the environment, to climate change?
What he is doing, I believe, is calling all of us to recognize that there are serious problems. There are serious problems that have to do with the environment, that have to do with the way in which we live and consume. And he's asking all of us to take a look at the world around us and what do we have to see that our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren will have the benefits of this magnificent creation that we enjoy. And so he's giving this call to everybody to participate in a discussion on how do we best serve one another in our home, which is this planet. I think the starting point is the recognition the Earth is our common home. This is where we all live.
How does he see the connection between caring for the Earth and caring for the people who are alive today and generations to come, and the focus on the poor?
He says in any discussion, whether you're talking about biodiversity, whether you're talking about the pollution of water, whether you're talking about deforestation, you need to start with the person, the human person. The goal of everything that we have is the flourishing of human life. So we start there, and then we say that has to take place in the context of a sustainable development of the resources that are available to us while protecting the planet. So you have these three elements: the person, the planet and reasonable, sustainable development.
It is not unprecedented for a pope to be taking a bold stand on an issue, a controversial issue. He's taking this farther though than his predecessors, and in Pope John Paul II, Pope Benedict, in saying there's an urgency here. How unprecedented is that?
Judy, I think what we're seeing in this encyclical is a recognition that there's a time element involved, but the urgency is to get the discussion going. The urgency is to recognize, and he begins the encyclical by listing all of these things that we all recognize are damaging the earth. The deforestation is one example. The lack of sufficient water, the lack of clean water. All of these things are facts.
How did he satisfy himself that the science is settled on whether humans are causing climate change? As you know, there's still argument out there.
Now, I don't see any declarations affirming any particular theory about any type of scientific understanding of what's happening. He's just pointing to the fact that it's there, that these things are clearly happening around us. And what he's saying is, should the starting point be, with all of this, not so much trying to fuss over this piece or that piece, but all of that together calls us to work together with a sense of urgency to make sure that the environment is preserved.
In effect, he's calling on political leaders, he's calling on captains of industry to change the direction they're going in, to make a dramatic changes in effect. How much power does the Pope have? Does he believe, do you believe, to get that kind of dramatic change to take place?
Well, I think that our Holy Father is asking, and that's why he's not imposing anything. He's not saying what the solutions are, but he is lifting up their problems, folks, and we need all of us to try to resolve these problems. What he brings is the moral dimension. It's not any longer what can we do. The question now is, what should we do? What ought we to do when we're dealing with this environment, when we're dealing with this good earth?
There is pushback already from climate change skeptics, from political conservatives. Just yesterday, one of the candidates for president for the Republican nomination, former Florida Governor Jeb Bush, who's Roman Catholic, said, I respect the Pope, but I think it's better to solve this problem in the political realm. He said, religion is about making us better as people and less about things in the political realm.
I think the Pope is saying to politicians, here's what you must do. Here's the answer. But what he is saying is, as spiritual leader, as a religious leader, I'm calling, together with other religious leaders, I'm calling everyone to look at the problems and begin to come up with some solutions. He's not saying to politicians, this is what your public policy or your political platform should be. And he's not saying to people involved in the world of industry, the world of development, this is what you must do. But he is saying, in light of all the problems that there are, and even if you might prioritize them differently, we all recognize we have to work together to resolve these problems.
But it sounds as if Governor Bush and others are saying, we're not going to listen to the Pope on this issue.
Well, I wonder if as time goes on and more people begin to look more deeply into this and hear what the Pope is saying, there'll be a stronger sense, realization of what he's actually asking.
How is the Pope, how are you as a leader in the Catholic Church going to follow up on this? What is the plan to move this forward beyond today's announcement?
Judy, that's a very, very important question. What we're going to have to do is using the announcement of the encyclical as a starting point, we're going to have to devote a lot of energy to education. diocese, for example, we're going to spend a lot of time getting this message out, pulling apart, unpacking this, helping our people understand better what it's saying. But this is a long-term project. But everything in the church is long-term.
Long-term, and yet Pope is trying to influence what comes out of the climate change summit this winter in Paris.
It's true. There are some short-term measures, but the church doesn't see her teaching in those terms. She sees her teaching as formative of conscience that will be ultimately directive, long-term wise of a better world.
Cardinal Donald Worrell, Your Eminence, we thank you very much.
Judy, it's been a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you. God bless you.
After months of review, NBC News announced today that longtime anchorman Brian Williams will not be returning as anchor of the network's nightly news program. He will, however, stay with NBC and join its cable outlet, MSNBC, as a breaking news anchor. Lester Holt, Williams' temporary replacement, will now officially get the job as anchor of NBC Nightly News. Williams was suspended after the discovery that he fabricated a story about coming under fire on a helicopter during the Iraq War. But there was more. Howard Schnabel has the story.
An internal NBC review also found Williams in a number of inaccurate statements about his experience reporting in the field. The network has called a move to MSNBC a chance for Williams to earn back everyone's trust. Two views on the wisdom of his decision. Andrew Hayward is the former president of CBS News. Mark Feldstein is a professor at the University of Maryland College of Journalism. He's a former investigative correspondent for ABC and CNN. He worked at NBC. So, Andrew Hayward, I want to start with you. It seems that this was a practical decision more so than a principled one. If Brian Williams can be trusted, why not give him his job back? If he can't be trusted, doesn't this raise the double standard? Is MSNBC just a little lower than NBC?
Well, I don't think there's a double standard for accuracy. The audience, the viewers, has the right to expect accuracy from a reporter reporting from a mudslide in Marin County, just as from the anchor of an evening newscast. I do think there's a hierarchy in the television news world, and the evening news or the nightly news has traditionally been the so-called flagship program, and with the slight exception of ABC, traditionally the anchor of that program has been the so-called face of the network. So I think in this case, Brian is paying a price for severe errors in judgment. I don't think that anybody is going to hold him to a different standard for accuracy. And I think the viewers will understand exactly what's going on and will not think that somehow they're being given some kind of second-class citizen as a journalist.
Mark Feldstein, can Williams regain his credibility as the face of breaking news, as NBC would like him to?
I don't know. We'll see. I'm skeptical. You know, if you don't tell the truth, whether it's on the air or your newscast or an entertainment show, and you do it 10 or 11 times, which is what's been reported, I think there's a cloud that's going to hang over him. And it was breaking news where he got himself into trouble in the first place, telling some of these exaggerations. You know, as a journalism professor, I try to teach my students that the most important thing is the truth, is accuracy. And the trouble is, it sends a message that, no, really, fame matters more, slickness matters more, being cozy with your bosses matter more. That's trouble.
I respectfully agree with that. I don't think this is about coziness with the bosses. I think this was a business decision that the chairman of the NBC News Group, Ed Black, and his boss, Steve Burke, at NBC Universal, made in a business-like way. Yes, it's a practical decision, but I actually don't think that Brian is going to, well, the viewers will get to ultimately decide whether he can gain his credibility, but just slight correction, no one's alleging that he distorted his breaking news reporting. Most of these sins were well after the fact on talk shows. Again, I don't want to split hairs. These were very bad errors in judgment, but the one thing we can be pretty darn sure of is Brian Williams is never going to exaggerate his exploits again.
Well, we don't know this. You know, you're taking the network's word for it. They have kept their report secret, have not revealed it to the public. The investigation was held in secret by internal employees who once answered to Brian Williams. The fact that they're not releasing this report, frankly, is suspect. And it raises suspicions that NBC would never accept from a politician or corporation who are investigating. Mark Feldstein, how does this play into the role of the anchor changing? I mean, it's certainly different than it was 25 years ago. Well, that's true. I mean, you know, one of the dirty little secrets of television news is that in many respects, the famous anchors are glorified announcers. Present company accepted here. PBS is a smaller staff, not commercial, but most of the journalistic news gathering is done off camera by producers who are much lower paid. You know, there's this sort of Potemkin village that the public sees that suggests that these spaces are the real news gathering arm. Maybe if NBC were to copy that and we went to a sort of postmodern anchor, a younger, savvier, hipper audience might kind of get that. Andrew?
I think that Mark is onto something, that the pretense and the phony omniscience of television news has to either wither away or be stripped away for the next generation to accept it. But I think, ironically, Brian, this may seem counterintuitive, is a good person to do that. And cable is an environment where he's going to have a chance to do much more extemporaneous reporting, especially if he's doing live or breaking events. I think where the so-called Potemkin village breaks down is when you're covering a live breaking event. That is a very high level of skill. Yes, it's collaborative, but trust me, and I know Mark also, we both worked with lots of network anchors. They are very, very talented people, and certain Brian Williams among them.
All right, Andrew Hayward and Mark Feldstein, thanks so much.
You bet.
Today, the Supreme Court, two significant rulings on the First Amendment. The court ruled 5-4 that the Texas state government has the right to not issue Confederate flag license plates. And in a unanimous decision, the court said the sign ordinance in the town of Gilbert, Arizona, was too restrictive of a local church. One of these cases, as always, is Marcia Boyle of National Law Journal. Marcia, hi, Judy. Welcome. So let's take this Texas license plate case first. This was a case that was brought on behalf of the Confederate Sons of Confederate Veterans.
Right. They wanted to have a specialty license plate that included the Confederate battle flag. The state of Texas turned them down. They had a number of public comments finding that display offensive. The Supreme Court today ruled that Texas did not violate the First Amendment rights of this organization. Justice Breyer wrote the opinion. He said that this is not private speech protected by the First Amendment. What appears on your license plate is government speech. Government has traditionally used license plates to convey messages. It uses license plates for identification and registration of drivers, and the state ultimately has the authority to decide what goes on the license plate. He asked, why would this organization prefer its message on a license plate instead of maybe a bumper sticker next to the license plate? And he said, perhaps it's because they want the message to appear to be the official message of the state. But just as the state can't compel a private party to convey a state message that it disagrees with, he said, Sons of Confederate Veterans can't compel the state to convey a message with which it disagrees.
And the dissenters, among other things, argue that these license plates can issue a private, that they are privately owned, privately.
Justice Alito wrote the dissent, and he said this is private speech protected by the First Amendment, and this denial of the display was blatant viewpoint discrimination. He said, how could any reasonable person looking at a display plate that says rather be golfing think that was the official message of the state?
How common, Marcia, for Justice Clarence Thomas to vote with the four liberal justices?
I wouldn't say it's common, but I'd also say it's not unusual to see crossovers between the left and the right sides of the bench. And I think it's a reminder to us that these are not monolithic blocks on the court, and there are certain issues where they do disagree even within their particular ideological groupings.
And interesting, this of course had to do with the Confederate flag.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about the Arizona decision. This was a case about regulating road signs and involved a church and where it wanted to put a directional sign.
Right. Gilbert, Arizona had a sign code, and it categorized signs as ideological, political, and directional. The Good News Community Church needed directional signs because it didn't have a permanent home. It had to tell people where it was meeting each week. They ran afoul of the time limits on temporary directional signs. They sued the town, saying that their First Amendment speech rights were being violated. And today, in a unanimous decision, Justice Thomas, he wrote that the town did violate the First Amendment rights of this church.
Now, some of the dissenters, at least one of them, pointed out that their concern is that this could have wider repercussions, and this could affect what many states and do around the country.
The reason for this is Justice Thomas applied the Constitution's toughest test for constitutionality to this town sign code. He said that the code was content-based and had to survive strict scrutiny. That is, this town could only keep its code if it could justify it as serving compelling government interests. It was narrowly tailored to do that. And he said that the code was hopelessly under-inclusive. Justice Kagan, as you just noted,
not a dissenter. I misspoke.
No, she wasn't
expressing concern.
Exactly. She said that this code was so unconstitutional it could have failed under lesser scrutiny, but because Justice Thomas applied the toughest scrutiny, she felt many reasonable sign codes will be challenged and may also be struck down. And she said the Supreme Court itself may become a Supreme Board of Sign Review as those cases get to it.
Language we're going to remember. Marcia Coyle, and big decisions to come from this court.
We have about 11 left. Same-sex marriage, major challenge to a health care law. The court will meet again Monday.
Marcia Coyle, thank you.
My pleasure.
This month, the administration is expected to revamp workplace rules that would make millions more workers eligible for overtime pay. Economics correspondent Paul Solomon reports. It's part of our weekly segment, Making Sense, which airs every Thursday on the NewsHour.
Time to make the donut. Fred the baker. Time to make the donuts. Icon for the freshness of Dunkin' Donuts more than 30 years ago. Make them at least twice every day to make donuts. Fred was a fixture, but the reality of one Dunkin' Donuts worker looked a lot like the ads.
I'm working 75 hours a week or 80 hours a week.
For years, Ghassan Marzouk worked Fred-like hours as a salaried manager at this outlet outside Boston. Problem is, he never saw 1 cent in overtime.
You work 40 hours or you work 100 hours, it's the same pay.
Divide Marzouk's hours by his barely $800 a week salary, and on a per hour basis,
I'm making only $9, $10 an hour, which is that's even lower than the regular employees what they are making.
Under current law, you get time and a half for every hour you work in a week past 40, unless you make more than $23,600 a year and you're an executive, administrator, or professional with advanced knowledge. Marzouk's employer classified him as an executive, even though he very often did the same work as the hourly employees.
You're serving customers, you're pouring coffee, you're cleaning, you clean the bathrooms, clean the parking lot. The title does not mean anything.
The salary threshold under which all employees were paid overtime in 1975, if you figure in inflation, would now be $51,000, compared to today's actual $23,600, an amount that's been raised just once in the last 40 years. More than 60% of salaried employees were eligible for overtime in 1975. Today, less than 10% qualify. So last year, President Obama signed a memorandum directing the Department of Labor to update overtime rules to help workers like Marzouk.
Now, overtime's a pretty simple idea. If you have to work more, you should get paid more.
Progressive mega investor Nick Hanauer first made us aware of the overtime issue's contribution to economic inequality in a post on our Making Sense website that drew nearly 1 million readers.
A high overtime threshold is indispensable to creating a thriving middle class because in the absence of it, an employer like me will pitch a fake title like assistant manager to somebody and work them 60 hours a week instead of 40 and get 20 hours of work for free.
As these regulations come out that we're all hoping will come out, that will help a lot of people going forward.
Lawyer Shannon Liss Reardon argues her client, Ghassan Marzouk, should have received overtime and has sued his former employer, which runs 50 Dunkin' Donuts outlets in Massachusetts.
This is common practice in America because they put their managers on salary. They can work their managers as many hours as they want.
Consider former Dollar General store manager Dawn Huey. She was paid $35,000 a year, but regularly worked 60 to 70 hours a week. No overtime.
I'm the free help. I could never commit to anything as far as plans with friends or family because my store was always my number one responsibility.
Any day now, the administration is expected to redefine which workers are exempt and hike the threshold. Labor advocates say if it's posted at $51,000 a year, more than 6 million workers would automatically qualify for overtime pay. But, say employers,
I think many more people are going to get overtime as a result of this rule.
Fact is, says David Frank of the National Retail Federation, his industry simply can't afford the estimated $9.5 billion a year it would cost to pay overtime to every worker, making up to $51,000 a year.
Instead of providing overtime for most workers, employers are going to make rational choices and are going to spread the same amount of money across a slightly larger pool of hourly and part-time workers.
In other words, no more behind-the-counter executives. At White Castle, famous for its square sliders, Vice President Jamie Richardson thinks the company's almost 400 salaried general managers will be given lower benefits or switch to hourly jobs. That, he says, would stifle career advancement.
It would take opportunity away from literally hundreds of people who worked so hard to get to that point. Our general managers take immense pride in being considered salaried. That's a big accomplishment.
Overtime activist Nick Hanauer's response?
A company has a certain amount of responsibility to hand out, and people are not going to have less responsibility because they don't have fake titles anymore. It's just not true.
But what about the argument that employers are simply not going to have managers anymore like this because they can't afford to, and so everybody will be an hourly employee?
It's certainly likely that most employers won't pay people time and a half. That's very expensive. And what employers are likely to do is simply add workers to their payrolls, which lowers the unemployment rate and drives up wages, which is the source of the problem.
Whatever the changes, though, they will be too late for Ghassan Marzouk.
I never had the time to enjoy my kids' childhood, to be with them, because I dedicated my life to work at Dunkin' Donuts.
Parent-teacher conferences, did you go to that?
None.
Sports activity?
None.
Graduation of your kids?
I missed graduation.
Because you were working.
Marzouk emigrated to America from Kuwait, shooting for the American dream. But given the toll the job took, why did he put up with it? Suppose you'd said, no, I'm only going to work 40 hours. I'm sorry, I can't work anymore, and you're not paying me for that.
Be terminated. If you don't like it, you leave. But what did I do? I'm not an educated person. I don't have that degree.
And so these days, Ghassan Marzouk pumps gas. A part-time job. No overtime here either. This is economics correspondent Paul Solomon reporting for the PBS NewsHour from Boston.
And to Cuba. Tonight, Jeffrey Brown visits the Havana Biennial Art Show to report on Cuba's booming art market, as well as the very real limits on free expression that remain in this socialist country. It's another installment in our series this week, The Cuban Evolution.
On a recent fine evening in Havana, one could follow the yellow brick road leading into the sea. hopscotch through an American flag made of giant pickup sticks, enter a translucent cube, and look at the blue world. All part of a grand festival, the Havana Biennial.
There's art all along Havana's famous Molly Cone and throughout the city right now. Art, in fact, is one of the ways this isolated island has chosen to show itself to the world, and the world is paying attention.
This is the city's 12th biennial, but it's the first since the U.S. and Cuba announced efforts to normalize diplomatic relations. Everywhere you looked, in various corners of the city, work by artists from some 42 countries. Some of it fairly traditional, some of it not, like this tropical ice skating rink.
Why is the biennial so important here? What does it mean?
Margarita Sanchez is one of the biennial curators.
In Cuba, culture is very important. We live from work and express out our home in the street, maybe because of the weather, we don't know. Because we are Cubans, we are very expressive.
And increasingly very prominent on the international art scene. At the biennial, more than 250 Cuban artists exhibited works in the historic 16th century fortress on a bluff above Havana. Tony Rubenstein, an American with a new guidebook on Cuban contemporary art, says demand for this work is high.
The art market right now is exploding, especially the very top end. There are artists here who are already in the Tate Modern, that are already in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And when there is established here a Museum of Contemporary Art, those artists, the value of their works will explode.
Hello, senor! Robert Farber is one of the top collectors. At the biennial, he sponsored a gala affair to announce the first International Cuban Art Awards.
Our mission has been to spread the word on how great the art scene is in Cuba.
Farber began buying Cuban art in earnest and bulk in the last decade, after making millions on the sale of his contemporary Chinese art collection in 2007.
Is part of the attraction for you as a collector the forbidden?
I guess so. I never really thought about it before, but I like to collect and go where people haven't gone before.
It's a paradox in this home of the socialist revolution. Big money flowing from outside to artists inside.
The actual pull, the regional pull of the
Indeed, artists here are positively entrepreneurial. Adrian Fernandez and his partners were able to create this upscale studio after new laws made it possible to buy and sell property.
Well, thank you very much.
They now sell their work directly to consumers, mostly abroad, avoiding government-run galleries and reaping their own profits.
We deal directly with the people that reach us here, that we connect directly.
Welcome. Good afternoon, Adrian. How are you?
And indeed, he and his friends were receiving American visitors by the busload during the biennial.
Now, careful with the steps, Adrian. Welcome.
So it looks two-dimensional.
In another part of town, an even more unexpected scene, the Beverly Hills Women's Club, talking money and monopoly art at the home of one of Cuba's most prominent artists.
I mix it all with a Coca-Cola.
Peter Lopez takes old signs from American companies that were active here before the revolution and superimposes images and photographs on top of them.
I like to put some kind of metaphors in between.
It's a layering of times and messages, working through metaphor, he says, not overt politics. It can be read a variety of ways.
There are not too many left.
But what about the seeming contradiction of making art in a socialist country for Americans from Beverly Hills?
I put X amount of energy in a canvas or in a piece of metal on a sculpture or an installation. That energy could have a value market.
Yes, it does.
A person come and say, here is my energy, X amount of money that I'm willing to trade for you if you give me that. So that is how I balance that.
And isn't that capitalism?
Yeah, it could be capitalism, but no, I have no idea, and I don't think about it. I know there's something good that comes from my art.
Call it what you will, clearly things are changing here. But some things remain, casting a shadow over the biennial.
I've been accused by the government to incite people to be delinquent, that I incite people to do public disturbances.
In the 2009 biennial, Tanya Bruguera presented a piece of performance art in which Cubans were invited to speak their minds. When she tried to stage it again in December, in response to the announcement of a reopening of diplomatic relations with the U.S., she was stopped and detained, her passport taken.
Were you trying to provoke a response?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I believed that it was a historical moment and that art has a role to play during historical moments. People were in shock. Why? Because it is an announcement that puts into reflection and to doubt and to rethink what it means to be Cuban, what it means to be revolutionary. I think it was a historical moment because it was a moment of identity crisis for the revolution.
She says fellow Cuban artists practice a form of self-censorship.
It's kind of sad when you have to conform with, to just a little moment of complicity instead of being able to say, hey, this is what I think, and involve everybody else in that conversation.
Bruguera says she's been told she can leave Cuba, but only if she never returns, a deal she's refused. In the meantime, she awaits possible prosecution. The Havana Biennial minus Tanya Bruguera will be on display until June 22nd. From Cuba, I'm Jeffrey Brown with the PBS NewsHour.
Today we launch a new series on Facebook, and we're calling it Brief but Spectacular. These are interviews conducted by producer Steve Goldblum, featuring personal insights from artists, authors, leaders, and thinkers, telling us briefly what they are passionate about. Look for them every Thursday on NewsHour's Facebook page and often right here. We kicked off the series with a message of gratitude from poet Sarah Kay.
I tell people that spoken word poetry is a type of poetry that doesn't just want to live on paper, that something about it demands to be heard out loud and witnessed in person. It's a very immediate art form. You get to see visibly on people's faces and hear out loud if and when they are responding. There's a lot of people who have been led to believe that poetry is not for them, or they don't get poetry. And that always makes me sad, because a big part of what I try to do in my work, not only in my art, but also in my work in classrooms, is to try to make poetry feel a little bit more accessible. Sometimes I'm in an audience where it is helpful to give them time to realize that a poem is going to happen. And other times, it's actually more effective to not warn people. When I'm inside writing, all I can think about is how I should be outside living. When I'm outside living, all I can do is notice all there is to write about. When I read about love, I think, I should be out loving. When I love, I think, I need to read more. I'm stumbling in pursuit of this. I hunt patience with a vengeance. On mornings when my brother's tired muscles held to the pillow, my father used to tell him, for every moment you aren't playing basketball, someone else is on the court practicing. I spend most of my time wondering if I should be somewhere else. So, instead, I have learned to shape the words, thank you, with my first breath each morning, my last breath each night. When the very last breath comes, at least I will know I was grateful for all the places I was so sure I was not supposed to be, all the places I made it to, all the loves I held, all the words I wrote. And even if it is just for one moment, I know I will be exactly where I'm supposed to be.
And that's the NewsHour for tonight. On Friday, we have a special report from inside war-torn Yemen. I'm Gwen Eiffel.
And I'm Judy Woodruff. Join us online and again here tomorrow evening with Mark Shields and David Brooks. For all of us at the PBS NewsHour, thank you and good night.
progress. As of today, it is still to find an agreement and extends the current program before the end of the month. The ball is clearly in the Greek court to seize that last opportunity.
Meanwhile, Greek Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras traveled to St. Petersburg, Russia, to meet with President Vladimir Putin. There is widespread speculation that Tsipras is now seeking rescue loans from the Kremlin. The number of refugees fleeing war and persecution worldwide has reached an all-time high. The UN Refugee Agency reported today that nearly 60 million people were displaced from their homes last year. The largest single group, 1.6 million, came from Syria. In Hong Kong, the Governing Council today giving China's central government veto power over candidates for chief executive of the city. It was a victory for activists who staged long-running protests last year. Today, pro-Beijing lawmakers walked out before the vote. Able to say, hey, this is what I think, and involve everybody else in that conversation.
Ruggiero says she's been told she can leave Cuba, but only if she never returns. The deal she's refused. In the meantime, she awaits possible prosecution. The Havana Biennial Linus Tanya Bruguera on display until June 22nd. From Cuba, I'm Jeffrey Brown with PBS NewsHour.
Today we launch a new series on Facebook, and we're calling it Brief but Spectacular. These three
Poetry is conducted by producer Steve Goldblum, featuring personal insights of artists, authors, leaders, and thinkers, telling us briefly what they are passionate about. Look for them every Thursday on NewsHour's Facebook page and often right here. We kicked off the series with a message of gratitude from poet Sarah Kay. I
tell people that spoken word poetry is a type of poetry that doesn't just want to live on paper. That's the thing about it. It demands.